Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Crosby Kemper. I'm the director of the Kansas City Public Library, and we're very glad to have you here. I have a number of folks that I'd like to thank who are sponsors and partners. First of all, of course, those of you particularly who got the free books, free copies of Housekeeping. We want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts. We hope they continue with this program, which we've been particularly pleased with. We want to thank our Big Read partners, Park University and Jane Wood. I'd like to thank the Central Exchange, and Ellen D'Amato and Noreen Bridgham. The University of Iowa Alumni Association and Jane Van Voorhees played a crucial role in getting Marilynne to drive through the storms to Kansas City for our event tonight. I want to say thanks to KKFI and Tom Clammer for hosting the Big Read on the air. Tom in particular put a lot of effort into promoting it, and Tom was a part of my book club that read Housekeeping. Also thanks to KMBC, Channel 9 News, and Donna Pittman for her continued support of the Big Read and for her hosting of her own online book discussion of Housekeeping. We always want to thank our ongoing, longtime partner, fellow supporter of literature, lifelong learning in Kansas City, Rainy Day Books. We want to thank UMKC Women's Center and the Writers' Place, who both hosted community book group sessions. And we want to thank the Friends of the Kansas City Public Library for supporting the Bradbury Speaker Series, which makes tonight's event possible. We have great supporters. And I'd like to say that this is, the Big Read is a part of, and the way we've expanded the Big Read through the corporate edition, as we call it, with the larger corporate and institutional reading groups, reaching out through these various organizations, our partners, to try and turn this into gradually an everybody reads one book, community-wide kind of program. We want to, our goal, our vision in Kansas City for the Kansas City Public Library and for all of us who care about books is to turn this into a community of readers. And we think what we're doing with our partners in the Big Read is a good step in that direction. But you're here tonight, we're all here tonight to hear Marilynne Robinson. Since I first read Housekeeping in the early 80s, and I still have my dog-eared paperback copy, I've thought Marilynne Robinson is one of the most extraordinary of American writers. And reading Gilead, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and Home, the stories of people in our part of the country who have families, sometimes unusual families, not unknown in our part of the country, and the trials and tribulations of those families, the unique encounters with the landscape and with each other. There's a quality in these books that is extraordinary, and also in her essays. She has an essay on Dietrich Bonhoeffer that I read recently about the quality of grace, not only in his life, but in his writing and in his legacy. And it's that quality of grace, I think, that Marilynne Robinson sheds from her novels on her readers. So it's a great pleasure to have her here tonight. And we structured this, as we did last year with Tobias Wolff, as a conversation with our great partners from New Letters on the Air. We're grateful to Bob Stewart and New Letters. We're grateful to UMKC, and most of all grateful to Kansas City's premier interviewer, Angela Elam, who, like me, commutes from Lawrence, Kansas, to her day job in Kansas City, and we're honored to have her here to interview Marilynne Robinson. So, ladies and gentlemen, Angela Elam.
I'm Angela Elam, and of course this is Marilynne Robinson, and we are so thrilled to have her with us tonight. And I am so thrilled to even be a part of the Big Read and everything that our library system does for us. And so I'd like to give a round of applause to the library and everyone who works here. So anyway, I also wanted to give you just a few notes before we get started. This is recorded for broadcast later on. So don't be timid to be yourself. If you want to laugh, laugh. If you want to applaud, applaud. Sometimes people feel like if it's being recorded, they've got to be extra quiet. You are a part of this recording, so we want you to take part in it. So don't be inhibited by that. The other thing that I wanted to do is to tell you that if you missed the big read this last year with Tobias Wolff, we're rerunning that show coming up at the end of May. So if you'd like to tune in and hear last year's big read on Old School, you can hear it. If you missed it the first time it came around. And if you're curious about our schedule, go to our website, www.newletters.org/radio. You'll see what's coming on the air. And also, we have a brand new magazine out with New Letters Magazine, so you might want to check it out while you're on the site. So please do that. We've been in the process, we got a grant for Save America's Treasures to digitize a lot of our reel-to-reel recordings because the show's been on since 1977. I have not been there the entire time. I have not. So anyway, Marilynne has been on our show twice. Once in 1989, and you were talking a lot about housekeeping at that point, but you've got a couple of nonfiction books out as well. I'm going to adjust your mic a little bit.
All right.
And are you comfortable?
Yes.
Okay.
Whoops. I was.
This is always my fear. Okay, hang on. I know.
Okay.
This happened to me last time, so I'll try not to, except it was me. So 1989, and then again in 2005, after you had won the Pulitzer Prize for your second novel, Gilead. And so I feel like you're one of our American treasures that we have. So
well, thank you so much.
It's a real thrill to have you here tonight. You know, at the time that the 1989 interview was done by Rebecca Presson, she was talking to you about housekeeping. And at that point, since the novel came out in 1980, you had written it over a decade before, and you said in that interview that you felt like it had been so long that someone else had written it. And I was wondering how you feel about that now, 30 years past the time that it's come out. I mean, have you reread it? Do you go back and visit it so that you can talk about it, or is it like a memory for you?
When I go back to visit it, it's usually because somebody has asked me to read from it. It's an interesting thing. I'm always afraid of what I have done, as if it will overdetermine what I might do. So I tend not to look at my books again. I mean, you know, except
when you're forced to.
When I'm forced to, yes. When it's an assignment, you know.
Yeah, I wondered about that. Does it, when you go back and see it, are the characters like old friends to you? Are they like distant relatives? I mean, how do you relate to the book?
I don't have any problem relating to it, actually. You know, sometimes when I'm doing a reading from it, you know, I still think, oh, here comes that sentence that I never got right. But in general, I think my feelings toward it are pretty stable, you know.
Yeah. Sandpoint, Idaho was where you were born.
Yes.
And raised for the most part. And though I guess you lived in different parts of Idaho.
Yes, I lived in Coeur d'Alene more than in Sandpoint.
And so how much is Fingerbone, the town in the novel Housekeeping, like Sandpoint, or is it kind of an amalgamation of different places in Idaho?
Well, for the most part, I mean, topographically, it is Sandpoint, the Long Bridge and the Big Lake and all that. But the story is basically an invention. There's people that know the area know that I borrowed a part of the shoreline of Coeur d'Alene for one passage, and so on. But basically, it's more of what the landscape suggested, you know. But it's a very dramatic landscape. It really, to approach this town, you cross a very long bridge over a very big lake. And from my early childhood, I would watch this, you know. And it was very suggestive to me. And also the fact that because my family had lived there, there were all sorts of narratives about the lake, you know. It wasn't just a piece of water, you know.
Didn't you have an uncle, your mother's brother, who actually died in the lake?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that would have an impact, I would think, on, you know, not just the lake itself, but it becomes bigger than what it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah. The railroad also plays a part in this novel. I mean, the father, who we don't really meet, but we know about him in the novel itself, was connected with the railroad. And then Sylvie, who's one of the aunts who raises the two young girls, is kind of a hobo, you know, and it drifted around a bit for the railroad. Do you have any familial connection with railroads, or was it kind of a symbol for you for the American West? I mean, when you were writing that, what made you pull in the railroad?
Well, as it happens, Sandpoint is a sort of junction for railroads. There are lots of lumber and so on shipped from there and through there. I always remember hearing train whistles, you know, which are very haunting in that landscape. And you know, there were hobos too. There were many stories about the Depression when they were really a sort of an important feature of the landscape, and also they were still drifting through when I was a child, and haunting. You know, you just couldn't help but think about it.
You know, it's so odd, though, because I guess in my own imagination, I usually think of hobos as being guys, you know, men. You don't really see women portrayed that way very often. And yet, you know, they must have been men and women drifting that way.
You know, it's not, you know, Housekeeping is really not a realist novel in my understanding of it. And I was, in the character of Sylvie, I'm talking as much about a sort of an atmosphere that hovered around the place as you know, I'm not creating a sociology of the place. I'm basically creating an atmospherics of the place. And so many things merge in Sylvie.
Yeah. It is very atmospheric as a novel. I mean, it's very dreamlike. I found when I first read it, it takes you off into another world where, to me, it almost felt, and this didn't have to do with the landscape necessarily that you described, but I've spent some time in the Northwest myself, and actually in Oregon along the coast, and there was sometimes this heavy fog that came in, and it had that dreamlike quality that I felt was captured in this. And
good, because that's what I wanted.
Yeah, it was a very haunting thing. You've been described as a very lyrical writer, and a lot of people want to call your work poetic, and yet I read somewhere that you've never written poetry. Is that still true? I mean, or
it's
have you
very
ever?
True. When I was a little kid, I wrote bad little kid poetry. You know, I mean, that was, you know, my entree into letters, shall we say. But when I got old enough to have any sense at all, I could see what bad poems they were. And then I actually tried writing an epic about the creation of the universe, but I had to give up because I ran out of rhymes. That was a sobering experience. And it was about at that time that I began to think that it was really prose where my future lay. Although I thought of my future in a very odd way, in a sort of privileged way, which is that I had no realistic sense of a future. You know, I just thought, I'm going to write. Perhaps nobody will ever. I used to hide everything I wrote under a mattress. My brother was my main reader. I never anticipated having other readers. It was wonderful, actually, you know, because my motives were so pure.
No joke. I mean, you know, most people, I mean, seriously, to think that you started writing this novel without ever expecting it to be published. You know, that I think is very unusual. I think a lot of people, when they're writing something, their idea is that they're going to get it out there. I mean, you left the Northwest to go back east to go to Brown University, and you studied English, and then you went back to the Northwest to Seattle, where you got your dissertation. You wrote your dissertation on Shakespeare.
Yes.
What aspect of Shakespeare?
Actually, the history plays, the early history plays. And they turned out to be much more sort of historiographical than literary, the things that I wrote for my dissertation, which was an important education for me. I learned many things that have been useful subsequently.
I was about to say, how much, you know, what kind of repercussions do you think that's had in your writing?
I found out that you should always check people's sources. When I was in graduate school, there was a clutch of scholars who just dominated the field, and I think that's almost always true at any time of any field. And I redid some of the research that lay behind these books, and I found a great deal of quoting out of context or allusions to things that the writer was clearly unaware of, that sort of thing. It was really kind of a subversive thing to do, but it taught me a very healthy skepticism that I've exploited in my subsequent life.
Oh, that's great. Well, you went to France and you wrote the bulk of Housekeeping, I read, in France.
Yes, I did.
Do you think it was kind of a longing for your home place that got you started on it? I mean, what was the impetus to write this book in the first place?
Well, it was on my mind. I mean, that landscape, it's not the easiest place in the world for people to live, And so there's a sort of self-selecting population of people who just find it so beautiful they can't leave. I left. But there's a way in which you really can't leave a landscape like that, And the thing I was living in France, I was living in the country. I had this sort of 10-mile commute to the college that I was teaching in. And there were little kids in the countryside who were very interested in us as Americans. And they would come, and it was a French house with the French windows, that go clear to the ground. And so these little kids would come and knock on the glass just to see us move, like we were aquarium fish. And they were very sweet, and I didn't want to be unpleasant. And so I went into a little back room and closed the door, the window. And so I was in a completely dark space with a little tiny unsteady lamp and a notebook and a pen. And it was like being in a sensory deprivation chamber in the sense that, suddenly I could remember things that I was amazed to find that I could remember. And it was really strange. I mean, I would say to myself, I am the only person in the universe who is in a dark room in France remembering Idaho. So seldom you can say that about any experience, But it was interesting because under those circumstances, the memories became almost uncannily vivid. And that became a reason for writing in itself, finding out what was in my memory and my consciousness.
So you kind of lost that feeling that you were outside of America. You became involved with the story that you were trying to tell then. Did you know that it was a novel, or did you start out writing an essay? I mean, why were you in France anyway?
I was teaching Shakespeare.
Oh, of course.
and written English. I never really intended to be an essay writer. That's something that sort of came as a surprise. But I knew by that time already that I could not write short fiction. I had taken writing classes at Brown, which were extremely helpful to me. but they were oriented, as these things tend to be, toward short fiction. And so I would make this sort of great beginning, you know, the start of the arc, and then that would be it was a terrible short story. But, you know, I could see that those 15 characters that I'd gotten into 10 pages, you know.
There's
perhaps...
that Shakespearean influence. Yeah, yeah.
No, I'm not a short story writer. I've never been good at it.
Yeah. Well, I can see why, because when you look at this book, you're dealing not just with the two young women and their aunt. I mean, you're looking at the generations, and then when you look at Gilead, it's certainly dealing with several generations of a family. And then the subsequent novel, Home, which I just finished today, is wonderful. It's a wonderful novel. That too is looking at a family through generations. So how can you do that in a short story? Unless there are a whole bunch of short stories that you string together. But
I've never found any way to do that.
yeah. You're enthralled with, I think, family and the repercussions that acts have within a family life. Don't you think that's sort of the thing that you are really exploring so much in all of your books?
I think so. I mean, it's certainly true in my case that my life as it fell out is very much a consequence of decisions that were made by my great-grandparents or my grandparents, you know. And I think that's probably true in a greater or lesser degree for virtually anybody.
Yeah. You know, you always bring in parts of the Bible in your writing. It's apparent that the Bible has been a very big source of influence for you. And I read that you're actually working on a book now about the Bible.
Yes, I am. Less than I ought to be, but yes, I am. I'm writing about the Old Testament. I have another, I want to suggest another critical approach, basically, to the Old Testament than the one that's been dominant since about 1850, you know.
Wow, that's a big job.
It's huge. But nevertheless, it's very interesting for me. It's a very profound interest in my life.
Is it going to be a series of essays, or is it?
Probably so, or call them chapters. You can't really tell the difference, you know.
Yeah, no, that's true. Have you got a name for it yet?
No,
okay.
But it is under contract and all that sort of thing. It was actually my publisher's idea, which is always gratifying.
Yeah. Oh, that is wonderful. This whole big read project here at the library was kicked off with the book critic Michael Durda. Mm-hmm. Durda? Did I say that right? Is that right? Yeah. And he mentioned strawberries. You're talking about strawberries through your book, and he was saying that it represented a oneness with nature for you. Now, as a writer, do you really think about things like that?
Well, you know, when we were little kids, one of the great pleasures of life was finding wild strawberries in the woods. And they were always beautiful. They're all usually in a sort of burned-off clearing or something, you know, so that they're in a sort of a celestial light because the trees are not there. You know, in a way, it was a very, you know, communion-like in a certain sense, because there they were in very wild places, very sweet. There's nothing like a wild strawberry.
It was funny to know that he had said that, because when I read Home, your third novel, there's a passage in that book too where the brother and sister are sharing some strawberries, you know, and I thought, well, this is interesting. So is she thinking oneness with nature here too? You know, how much of writing, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, is I know that you choose your words carefully. I mean, it's obvious that you spend a lot of time with your writing that way. But how much of your writing, in turn, surprises you, too, when things come out? I mean, is it always that thought out that this is a metaphor for something else?
No, it's not. If it doesn't have that resonance for me, then I would never try to imply that it should have that resonance, you know. I made jokes with myself when I was writing Housekeeping, because I didn't really anticipate a readership, you know. And one of them was that I I restricted Ruth basically to allusions that I would have been capable of, more or less, at her age. And I took a lot of Latin. That was one of the benefits of my Idaho education. I had a lot of Latin. And in one of my Latin textbooks, there was the destruction of Carthage on one page, and then a few pages on the reconstruction of the world after the flood narrative. And so, these things fused in my mind in a sense, but people think of that as a sort of learned allusion, but it actually comes out of my Latin 3 textbook.
I love that. Well, so when you wrote this book, how did it end up at a publisher, since you didn't really write it for anyone to read necessarily? How did it end up there?
Well, I knew a man who was on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts who published novels, and I casually mentioned to him that I'd written one, and he said, "Can I see it?" And so I said, "Sure," and I gave him the manuscript, which was complete except for the very ending. He sent it to his agent. He didn't tell me he was doing it. The first thing I knew, I got a letter from his agent telling me she would be happy to represent the book, but it would be very hard to place. And then she gave it to Farrar, Straus Giroux, and they bought it, so it was suddenly published.
That is a great story.
It is, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. And was that the point where you thought, okay, now I'm a writer?
Well, I've always sort of avoided that. I think that, I've always been a little bit afraid of it because it seems to imply, I don't know, that a sort of carapace of a certain kind, however attractive, descends on you or is exuded by you or something like that. So I sort of think of myself as basically a freelance civilian who sometimes writes one thing, sometimes writes another.
Yeah, but then you teach at the Iowa Writers Workshop, right? So they must have considered you a writer when you got the job there.
Yes, but that was sufficient for my purposes. They're welcome to think of me as a writer.
Well, it was such a long time between novels, between your first novel. That was published in 1980, and then Gilead came out in, was it 2004 that it came out, and won the Pulitzer Prize in 2005, I think, something like that. Anyway, that's such a long period of time, and yet Home followed Gilead much sooner, and those two stories are intertwined somewhat with some of the same
very
families.
much intertwined, yes.
But that's when it came out the next time. Was that originally all one piece, or were you so caught up with that family and that scene in Gilead? Because Home is also, for those of you who might not have read that yet, and I recommend you read both of those novels, it's also set in Gilead, and it's just looking at a different family that's sort of tangential to I guess they're all intertwined. But was it all one piece when you began, and you thought, I need to break this up or it's going to be a huge novel, or?
No. When I wrote Housekeeping, I was actually afraid of repeating myself. And I would write a little bit of this and that, and it sounded like me. And so I would think, I don't want to do that. I don't know, that's probably perverse, but nevertheless. And so what I did during those years was write nonfiction and also do an enormous amount of reading on my own, reading of all sorts of things, because I wanted to be able to write from a different mind. Then when for some reason, I had suddenly John Ames in my mind, so I wrote that book. And then, after Housekeeping, I had been sort of haunted by these characters, and I went through a period of mourning, actually, waiting for them to dissipate and be gone. And when I finished Gilead, I had the same feeling, and then I thought, why am I doing this? If they want their lives, these other characters, why don't I let them have their lives, So I wrote out of energies in a certain sense that I felt were not satisfied in Gilead itself. But I hadn't intended to write a second book.
That's fascinating. And it came really so much, well, I guess it wasn't that much sooner, but compared to the gap in your first two books, I mean, it came, what, 5 years later or something like that.
I was very busy during that gap. I enjoyed that gap.
That's right. You have two children.
Yes,
Yeah.
And I read a lot of books. I mean, it's hard, you know, the way, I have every degree of respect for American education. I virtually have never left an educational institution since I first set foot in one. But there is a way in which we tend to conventionalize our thinking. And you have to really, after your initial education, you have to re-educate yourself in order to get out of it, I think. That was certainly my feeling. And so I think of those years as my re-education, and I value them very much.
Well, I wonder when you were working on Gilead, for instance, and it's 3 generations of ministers, or you know, it's obvious. I mean, it's no surprise to me. Let's put it this way: that you're writing a book about the Bible in some ways or other, because John Ames in Gilead and actually the one in Home as well, they're Congregationalist ministers.
Ames is Congregationalist, Boughton is Presbyterian.
Right.
And frankly, the difference is minimal to the point of vanishing altogether. It only matters to them, you know, but...
They're both Protestants.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And you yourself have spent some time in the Congregationalist church. Was that what piqued your interest in that, in looking at those issues?
Also, it was just something that I felt very comfortable writing about, simply because I'd been a spectator, you know, of Congregationalism for, well, 35 years perhaps, you know.
Yeah. I do think it echoes throughout your writing. You mentioned when you studied in your undergraduate years, I've read that you were very much influenced by 19th century and early 20th century writers, and Moby Dick was one of your favorite novels. Is it still? Has it held
Absolutely.
up for you?
No question about it. I teach it fairly often at the workshop. I spend a whole semester on it.
Oh,
and
wow.
It bears up very well. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much anyone else felt this way, but you know, when you start out the novel, "My name is Ruth," it's such a simple, declarative sentence, you can't help but think, "Call me Ishmael," you know? And so, you know, do you think those reverberations were there for you?
I was joking. I mean, one great difference is she doesn't say, "Call me Ruth." You know, her name actually is Ruth.
Right. My name is Ruth, not "Call me Ruth," right? My name is Ruth. So, yeah, it's something else that hit me today, too. The main character, the main voice in Home, this third novel, is a young woman who's had to come back home, and she's basically taking care of her elderly father, who is the Presbyterian minister, retired, that Marilynne just mentioned. And their neighbor is John Amos, who appears in Gilead too. But anyway, she's there, and she's, I think, 38 in the novel. And I couldn't get over how much that novel was about coming home and reestablishing your home, and how much in the first novel, in some ways, this could be Ruth grown up, even though their family situations were very different. But the character could have been, you know, Ruth and Sylvie were escaping home and running away from home, and this was like almost a circular thing of bringing a character back home. Do you think that rings true?
Well, I think that it's clear that the idea of home really fascinates me, no matter how people exist in relation to it, you know. It's true. I mean, But, you know, Glory, bless her heart, is not home because she wants to be.
That's
so
true.
It's a very ambiguous sort of experience for her.
But in the end, you feel like she embraces it somewhat.
Yes, I think she
Yeah,
does.
or accepts what comes her way. So,
Or the larger meaning of it. You know.
yes, maybe that's a better way to put it, the larger meaning of home. So, part of the Big Read program here in Kansas City, one of the programs was to watch the movie that was made of Housekeeping. And I was talking to Paul Smith, one of the people that's, you know, you've met Paul, obviously, he's been dealing with it. And he felt that the movie had such a different mood than the book did for him. And so there was this disjointedness for him in that. And yet I know from one of the, from the earlier New Letters on the Air interview that you quite liked the movie at that point in time. I mean, have you seen the movie even in years? Maybe not.
No, it's been quite a long time, actually,
It's been
since
quite a long
I've seen
time.
it.
But did you feel like it was, I'm sure people here might be curious about that, who actually watched the movie at the library.
Right. Well, you know, I had a special relation with that movie in a certain sense because it was made by Bill Forsyth at the peak of his career. He might have another peak, but he was doing great at that time. And he spent years of time putting together financing. He traveled all over the world looking for financing for that film. And he did it because he did not want to violate the integrity of the book. I mean, he could have had money if he had agreed to make a love affair between Sylvie and the sheriff, for example. And as it was, you know, miraculously it came together, but it came together around a pretty small budget. And so all kinds of choices were really forced on him by circumstance. Also, he and his crew are all Scots, and they had no idea what it would be like to be, you know, in Canada in November. And they had child actresses. They were going to put great emphasis on the scene, the fallen house scene. And so they went up on, first of all, they had a wonderful time. They traveled all over the country. They found a dugout house that had fallen into its foundation, all this sort of thing. They photographed it from a million angles. They loaded it on a truck. They bought it, of course. And so they used a lot of time and a lot of budget on this. And then they went up to the mountainside in Canada, and they reconstructed what they had found. And by the time they were done, it was so cold that they could not humanely ask these little girls to be there, or the one little girl, Ruthie, to be there for any length of time at all. So after having made that investment, they could hardly use it, you know. And there were all sorts of things like that, where the emphasis in the film was not ideal from Bill Forsyth's own point of view, or in terms of his intentions. On the other hand, I did visit the set, and every time they were about to film a scene, everybody, the lighting man, the sound man, everybody, sat down and read the scene together from the book. They all carried the novel in their pockets. You can't ask for more than that, you know. You really have to understand the inevitable practical difficulties between something that is written and something that is filmed.
Well, and a film is such a collaborative art, and it becomes its own thing. Is it true that there's going to be a film of Gilead?
Well, you know, I've sold the rights, in fact, for a film that will be made of both Gilead and Home. They're going to make it into one narrative.
Oh, they are. So they're going to combine it.
Yes.
You didn't, but they are.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's
It'll
great.
be basically Gilead, I think. They just find it more easy to dramatize with elements from Home.
And who is it that's doing this?
Well, you know, it hasn't been publicly announced, and so I don't know.
We're scooping something?
You're scooping
It's
something.
so rare,
but it's,
New Letters on the Air scoops in.
it's kind of half a scoop in this case, because I feel as though I should leave it to the film producer to announce that.
Oh,
this
okay.
is
Okay.
nothing.
Rats. All right. Well, so I heard that next week you're going to go be inducted into what? What is it that you're going to be in? The American Academy of Arts and Sciences? Is that it?
The Arts and Letters.
Arts and Letters, I mean. But there's also something else to do with the sciences?
Well, in the fall, I'll be inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, that's great. So where are you traveling next week? To D.C.? Will that be
No,
in DC?
New York City.
New York City. Okay. I know I should know that. Don't tisk me. So, well, that's exciting for you. That's wonderful that both of those are happening in this year.
Yes, it is.
That's
I'm
really
very
terrific.
pleased.
Yeah. I want to let you know that all 3 of her novels are out there with Rainy Day Books. So you'll be able to go out. If you've read Housekeeping and already have that and haven't read Gilead and Home, they're out there available for you. I also wanted to let you know that there is a new book of essays that's due out. As you can see, I just got mine in the mail yesterday. But it's a series of essays that's coming out at the end of this book called Absence of Mind. And can you tell us just shortly what this entails? I mean, so people will have an idea. I mean, you've got one that's about Freud and Jung, but it's all sorts of, well, I'll let you talk about it instead of me.
Well, it's actually, I gave a series of lectures at Yale a year ago. The series is called the Terry Lectures. It's an old, long-standing series, and it's for theology and science, basically. Competence in those 2 areas is what's supposed to, distinguish the speaker. And so I gave these lectures on, basically how I view what I consider to be a completely empty and misconceived debate between science and religion, and basically taking the sort of history of ideas approach, what Freudian influence there is in it, what, how Auguste Comte contributes to it and all this sort of thing. It is what it is, as they say.
Do you think this has anything to do with you being inducted into the arts and sciences?
Well, I hope they don't retract the invitation.
Thank you so much.